your carbon project is legitimately removing, the declared amount of carbon from the atmosphere. So once that sort of framework is established, you would start your project. So when you're thinking about the context of a project, you always want to think about a beginning and an end. So at the beginning, what you're doing is establishing what's called a baseline. So your baseline would be how much, what practices are being done at the present. And then at the end of the project, you would think about what meaningful changes have happened relative to the status quo or relative to that baseline.
Let's talk about the power of hemp. From the farm field to finished goods. Learn all about it at the 2022 Midwest iHemp Expo, May 20th through 21st at the Lansing Center. Visit MidwestIHempExpo.com. See you there. All right, welcome to the iHemp Hour. My name's Dave Craybill. I'm with iHemp Michigan. iHemp Michigan's mission is to educate, inform, and promote the research, development, and cultivation of industrial hemp here in Michigan, and we're going to talk about carbon credits today. Blaine, you want to introduce our guests and get things rolling?
Well, absolutely. And before we start that, I want to say happy Groundhog Day. I know it's a day past that, but you know what happened if you're all into the news. Yep, there's 6 more weeks of winter left. Surprise, surprise on that. That's for sure. But we're going to talk about carbon credits and get all your questions answered on that. Certainly a hot topic right now with a lot of farmers and being able to, generate some revenue off of their hard work and what they're doing already. A lot of them are already doing these things, and now they can get some credit for it. So we've got 2 great guests on the show here today. Seth Boone, who's certainly no stranger to iHemp Michigan. And Seth will also be attending in May at the Expo too. So we're looking forward to that. We're going to talk about carbon credits there as well. But Seth is the director of the Hemp and VP of Business Development. He is tasked with ensuring PanXchange platform and analysis meets a rapidly evolving hemp industry needs and develop new opportunities in emerging agricultural markets. He was raised on a ranch in West Texas. He offers a background beginning in production agriculture before continuing his career merchandising feed grain and other agricultural commodities for StoneX and JBS. Seth obtained a Master in Agricultural Economics from Purdue University after pursuing an undergraduate at Oklahoma State University, and is passionate about growing and optimizing the impact of hemp and other sustainable markets. And Seth, we'll have to talk about this. I'm wondering if you're more of a Purdue fan or an Oklahoma fan when it comes to the basketball. And then Alec Meleshko, he leverages both an engineering background and a capital markets experience to provide well-rounded client service as a manager for PanXchange Frac Sand Community Exchange, industrial leading pricing platform. Alec's previous work experience includes supporting technically driven buy-side equity research in the emerging space for a subsidiary of Warburg Pincus. So there we go. So Seth and Alex, again, welcome to the show. We're grateful you guys took some time out of your busy schedules to help inform us about the carbon credit. So I think, Alex, we'll start with you.
All right. Thank you, Blaine. That was a great intro. So I guess to start things off, we'll introduce our firm a little bit and what we do with respect to carbon credits and how it's relevant to hemp. So I like to think of our business in carbon as a triple threat. So we really have like 3 key ways that we provide a client, such as a hemp farmer, value. So the first thing is that we help clients develop projects that lead to carbon removal. So we have methods or methodologies, they're called, or sets of guidelines that both the farmer who participates in the project and the auditor would follow along with, so that carbon credits can be generated and that the farmer can be resulted for the climate-friendly practices that they implement. So that's sort of the first business segment. The second business segment is our marketplace or our platform. So when someone earns a carbon credit, they can use our platform to list it and connect with a buyer and get the maximum or the full market value that the market's willing to bear for that carbon credit. So there's the most financial incentive to do these regenerative and climate-friendly practices, and there's really a financially incentivized pathway for money to flow and help fight against climate change. So that's really the second piece. The third thing is our marketplace collects data. So that can be data with respect to the amount of supply and demand of carbon credits. It can be the price of carbon credits, and some of the context in between. And that allows us to provide really great market intelligence and help us really assist our clients in navigating the market from end to end. So that's in a nutshell what we do. Hemp is a really great client type for us since we primarily focus on clients in agriculture and related things like ranch lands, grasslands, and things like that as well. But hemp's really great for a number of reasons. It's a great tool in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere, since it's such a fibrous crop. It sequesters a lot both in the plant and into the soil. And then it also has a lot of stable end uses where that CO2 that's captured in the plant can actually store the CO2 for the long term in its refined form. So that's kind of what we're doing in a nutshell.
So, can you give me a quick example? I'm sorry to cut you off there, Blaine, but give me a quick example so I could better understand how this would work. A farmer would plant hemp and then walk me through this because it's still I'm still trying to figure this out myself.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So the process in terms of going through a carbon project, there's about 5 key steps. So the first step, assuming let's say you already have like a hemp operation, you've planted some hemp. The first step would be to actually contact like a carbon program. So a carbon program would be an entity like ourselves, and there's a number of other ones out there. And what they would do is they would find a set of guidelines or a rubric that fits your business model. So it's something for you to follow along with and something for a third party to audit or verify to make sure that your carbon project is legitimately removing, the declared amount of carbon from the atmosphere. So once that sort of framework is established, you would start your project. So when you're thinking about the context of a project, you always want to think about a beginning and an end. So at the beginning, what you're doing is establishing what's called a baseline. So your baseline would be how much, what practices are being done at the present. And then at the end of the project, you would think about what meaningful changes have happened relative to the status quo or relative to that baseline. So for example, if you implemented certain regenerative practices on your farm, or you utilized methods that allowed you to sequester more carbon in your hemp or cannabis plant, let's just say, you would be rewarded with how much was changed relative to that baseline. So the fourth step would be, I guess, an auditing or a monitoring or review process by a third party. And once that's been done, credits can be issued and listed on a marketplace. So really that's kind of the sequence of steps there.
And just as a quick follow-up, so they're listed on a marketplace. Who buys these carbon credits?
So what's really great about carbon credits is they're becoming popular among a number of different entities. So I like to think of them in really 2 different camps. One is entities that have a vested interest in promoting a really good image to both customers and clients and investors. So those are companies like big banks and also big tech. So they have a very vested interest in maintaining
big manufacturing too, maybe something like that.
Big manufacturing and big oil and companies like that are another camp where not only do they have a vested interest in maintaining that good image and that good standing in society, but they also are heavy emitters. So that's sort of that other camp. Now, what's really interesting is there's such a strong adoption from Fortune 500 companies where more and more of them are including it in their investment mandates, in their investor presentations. Climate change and carbon emissions footprint is a must in terms of being addressed. And otherwise, they're actually deterring investment from doing so. So that's been a really pivotal change over the last probably decade or so. Maybe even 2 decades, arguably since the Kyoto Protocol. So what's also interesting is it's not just sort of a business-to-business market. So it's not just businesses acquiring carbon credits from other businesses, but we're even seeing the advent of individuals caring more about their individual climate impact. So these are celebrities where maybe they're going on tour or maybe they're flying across the country to shoot a movie. and they're purchasing carbon credits to offset any emissions from that because they want to show that they care. And I think that is actually a really positive step. I think it's a really interesting market because it's not just a B2B, but it's a business to everything kind of model.
And tremendously lucrative potentially for a hemp farmer, right?
Potentially, yes. So one of the reasons I guess it's lucrative, if you look at a traditional layout of a hemp farm has hemp planted in soil, is there's really a multitude of different carbon storage sites where CO2 from the atmosphere is permanently stored and removed, and you can get rewarded for it. So one obvious one is in the soil. So if you think about the process of photosynthesis, CO2 is basically inhaled into a plant, and it propagates through the plant into the soil where it's stored as organic carbon material. But also with hemp, because it has so many stable end uses, in some of these industrial products particularly, the CO2 that's sequestered into the plant and stored as carbon can actually be stored in durable end use materials after it's been manufactured and refined. And that's something that could, has the potential to qualify for carbon credits as well. And because of the number of different uses, it's a really interesting case study for carbon credits.
Wow. Thank you. Very informative.
And if I may add, I mean, hemp as well, through the carbon potential that it brings, it just opens up its viability as a rotational crop for traditional farmers as well. Because what we're looking at for like traditional row crops, they might have the biggest challenge of actually adopting carbon methodologies and in doing that. And hemp actually would be a very versatile tool for all of those farmers to utilize and sequester more carbon.
So, Alex, you talked a little bit about the baseline to start with, right?
Yep.
So what are we looking at on a baseline? Are we going back 2-3 years from when the farmer starts this process? So, and where I'm going with this is, traditionally what's going to happen here is as the hemp market expands, we get more into the fiber, we get more into the grain. We're going to be taking a farmer that traditionally would have done corn or soybeans, let's just say, maybe wheat, that kind of stuff, and rotating into doing more hemp. So where's our baseline start?
So that's definitely a good question. So I want to touch on a couple of things with respect to how people define their baseline. First off, I want to preface this by saying that every carbon program out there defines how you would actually create your baseline a little bit differently, but there's a few fundamental ingredients that are common to all of them. So one of those is when you're looking at your baseline, you want to establish approximately, give or take, around 3 years of historical data. And that can relate to agronomic practices, your rotations and things like that. The second thing is you want to establish what we call, I guess, more of a dynamic baseline. So a dynamic baseline you can think of as it's corrected for outside factors. So people want to create carbon credits to reward people for what they actually do and not what the planet is doing by itself. So we want to ensure that the baseline is corrected for things like weather and climate, and some of the surrounding latent conditions. So with that established, there are different, I guess, baseline definitions from different programs, but in general, I can say that with ours, what's nice is, for example, if you were trying to quantify the amount of carbon credits you'd get from sequestering CO2 as carbon into your soil, we look at it as though we don't care what practice you implement as long as the change from your baseline is positive. So if that results from switching from a traditional crop like corn into something that's a little bit more regenerative and eco-friendly like hemp, then that's a positive. But some are not counting, different types of land use practices. So it definitely depends on your program provider. But in general, a few years of historical data is a must in terms of establishing not only, a static baseline, but a dynamic one that takes into account some of those outside factors.
Alex,
So if somebody was doing fall plow, moldboard plowing, and they switched to minimum tillage, then that would be positive in that aspect. Even if they stayed with the same crop, there would still be a positive there, that kind of thing?
Correct. Yeah. So no tillage is really a great tool to sequester more CO2 in your soil because you're not overturning the soil and releasing CO2. So if that type of agronomic practice is implemented, you know, upon like the baseline being established and you know, upon your project starting and that's verified, that's a great tool to deploy in terms of earning carbon credits, and it's a really common one in practice today that we've seen both through our clients that we've seen, and then also in the markets more broadly.
Alex, you mentioned something about an audit. What type of other things are they looking for in the audits?
So that's a good question. So what they're looking for in the audit depends on what method you're deploying to really like sequester carbon or remove carbon from the atmosphere. So there's a number of different ones, and they're not just unique to agriculture. There are methods that are related to infrastructure in you know, capturing carbon that way, or reducing the amount of emissions they have that way. There are ones related to forestry and things like that. But also, you know, so what the auditor is looking for depends on the type of project. But in general, they're looking for evidence of what you're actually doing, evidence that you're following the rules outlined in both the method document and then also with respect to the overarching rules that are set by the program that you're working under. So really they act as sort of a supervisory and QA body. You know, one example would be for, let's say we take a look at a soil project, regardless of what you're farming, whether it's hemp or any other type of crop. You know, they would look at the amount of data to determine, you know, perhaps was the data collected in an appropriate manner? Was it tested in an appropriate manner? Were there enough tests taken? You know, are the results statistically significant, or is there more to the story? You know, has the evidence been appropriately documented? You know, were stakeholders appropriately consulted? And really going through that checklist of items to ensure that everything is checked off, every I is dotted, every T is crossed. So then when their report comes in and says this audit is complete, it's a seamless process to then take that report and then issue the client their carbon credits.
But does it take 3 years to get into this? Because you need 3 years of data collected to create that baseline? Are there many people that would already have that data? Is it the type of data they'd already have?
So again, every program is going to be a little bit different, but a common ask is about 3 years. So you don't have to have been farming hemp for 3 years. You might have just had to have farmland or data on your operation that dates back 3 years. It really depends on the type of project and what you're trying to do. But in general, the more data, the better in terms of establishing a concrete baseline. Something else to think about too is carbon credits are really only as good or only as valuable as the data and the auditing process behind them. So if you have really great data and you have a really great auditing process that's really concrete, scientifically sound, buyers are more receptive to those and they would want to pay a premium for those. If you had less data behind them and it wasn't as well audited or there wasn't as succinct of an audit trail, that may lead to a discount or it may alienate you from more stringent buyers. So it's a bit of a touch and feel process right now.
What when you keep saying buying, what are we looking at? A carbon credit? Is there a range that it worth? I'm just picking a number, $1 to $10 or something like that. What is it worth?
So a carbon credit represents 1 ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent that's reduced or removed from the atmosphere. And so the credit prices right now are ranging anywhere, to preface this, from agricultural projects between 15 and upper 20s per credit.
Oh, that high now. That's up
Yep.
from last year, isn't it?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing an increase in demand and definitely seeing some issues in terms of generating supply because it is such a, I guess, robust process to actually get projects off the ground and actually quantify and verify how much CO2 was removed, to make sure that there's no greenwashing in place and to make sure that you know the data and the science behind the credits is legitimate. And then, you know, looking at the buy side, the demand side, of course, there's more and more pressure seemingly every day for Fortune 500 companies, for companies big and small, public or private, even individuals to really think about their emissions impact. And so we're seeing more demand and kind of some friction in terms of getting started in terms of generating supply. So it's definitely translating into increased prices.
Now, when you say a ton, is that a ton of crop, a ton of carbon, or a ton of what? Again, this is all new to me.
So it's a metric ton of CO2.
Okay.
Yeah, or CO2 equivalent. So for those of you who might be a little bit confused as to what CO2 equivalent means, there's different greenhouse gases other than CO2, right? So one classic example would be methane. So you get that from pasture land, range land, things like that with cows. So when we think about the different types of greenhouse gases, we always kind of bring them back to a universal currency, and that's CO2. And how we kind of correlate the different greenhouse gases is what's known as global warming potential. So global warming potential is another way of saying the amount of heat trapping effect that they have. So methane is much more potent at trapping heat in the atmosphere than CO2 is. It's approximately 25 times as potent. So 1 ton of CO2 would translate to 25 tons of CO2 equivalent, or 25 carbon credits.
So methane, you mean?
Yeah, so 1 ton of methane is 25 times as potent, so it would translate to about 25 carbon credits, or tons of CO2 equivalent.
Yeah, I just saw a TED talk on that, and they said rice fields are a big cause of methane too, because of the nature of the wet field in creating the methane, the decomposition. It was interesting.
Yeah, potentially, there's a lot of different agricultural project types out there. A big one is related to agricultural methane, and I think that's one of the the leading, I guess, like business segments in carbon right now is how do we capture and store and transport and utilize the methane it's emanating from, whether it's a rice field or whether it's the digestion of manure from let's say a cattle operation.
So
we've talked about crops, right? But what about bring methane? What about livestock producers, and what about indoor growing, whether it be greenhouse or what they're doing in there? Is there a way for them to capture any of this credit stuff by changing anything too, or is it just mostly crops that we're talking about in soil?
So that's a good question. It really depends on your program provider. Different programs will have different types of projects. So there are some that specialize in, let's say your standard agricultural operation that has, crops growing in soil outside. There are ones that deal with, agriculture in the form of things like livestock projects. There are ones that deal with, projects germane to infrastructure or solar PV, or people building like the infrastructure around an indoor farm. So it really depends. There's a lot of different methodologies out there. There's a couple of different, repositories, you could say, that really house all these different methods. A great one is the CDM. So it's called Clean Development Mechanism, and it's really a large database of the different methods out there that you could potentially fit to your business, whether that's an indoor grow, whether that's an outdoor farm, whether you're building a road, whether you're building an office building. There's a lot of different methods out there in that database, and it's a great resource to see just how much is out there and how much is still left to be created.
Speaking of indoor grows, in my world, where we're above the 0.3 point on the THC,
Yep.
It's typically an indoor grow. They very, very seldom do you see folks growing cannabis outdoors, because God only knows what's going to get into it, right? So would the cannabis growers growing indoors be able to qualify for carbon credits?
So to answer that question, ultimately, indoor or outdoor, it would really depend on how much CO2 that they're sequestering relative to a baseline. That's the ultimate way to put it. So regardless of, whether you're indoors or outdoors, there would still be, CO2 that's in the air, right? So there's probably a limitation on how much you would relative to an outdoor grow, just because of the amount of air circulation, let's say, in an indoor grow. But that's something to, I guess, think about. But it has a lot of similar properties to hemp, obviously, in terms of the fact that it could, sequester CO2 through the plant into the soil and then store it in the plant itself if it had a stable end use. If that answers your question.
Yeah, that difference from the baseline to the change is really the issue, right? So it's not the fact that the plant's just soaking up this carbon, it's the change from what was there before, it sounds like.
Yeah, so it's where you establish your baseline, when you establish your baseline, and then how much you can sequester on top of that and provide a meaningful change from the status quo. The reason they do that ultimately is a marketing thing. People want to pay for meaningful changes relative to the status quo rather than paying people for what they're already doing. Just in terms of an overall like social or market experiment from firms past, and some of the very first firms that probably emerged in this space, I would say circa 2005. There was a lot of pushback on credits that were generated that way, and ultimately it was discerned that those are the credits that sell, the ones that are really defining that baseline and that meaningful change going forward.
So we've got a question that came in from Clyde. He said, would installation of utility, oh, we just went off there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just did that, I think.
Dave, you got it on your end. Then why don't you go ahead and ask it then, Dave?
I'm sorry, I hit the done button. Oh yeah, we're getting to that. So thanks, Clyde. Would installation of utility scale solar PV photovoltaics qualify for carbon credits?
So that's a good question, and it brings up a couple of interesting topics. So number one is there is a couple of different scopes that we look at in terms of carbon credit projects, whether it's an agricultural one or whether it's anything else. So the most common right now is called like scope 1, or sort of the most immediate impacts with respect to removing carbon from the atmosphere. So that would be things like directly removing CO2 using hemp and then through hemp into the soil. Scope 2 would be something that accounts for more of a net removal. So that can be things like taking into account the emissions on your farm with respect to harvesting and planting and things like that, like the diesel from your tractors or things like that. And then scope 3 really is the full scope of emissions with respect to the entire value chain and the entire business operation from end to end. And also looking at the removals from end to end and coming up with a net number. So really where industry is going is more of a comprehensive picture rather than, I guess, like a cherry picking picture. But in terms of something like solar PV, I think that's where, at least with the methodologies that we deploy, that would be something that would be more of a scope 3. In terms of the fact that just our firm in particularly is more focused on what's going on at the farm level rather than sort of the peripheral level where you're looking at things like more of a renewable power supply or a lower emissions power supply in kind of that broader sense.
Okay.
Well, I was going to bring that question up then, because if somebody switches from diesel to a biofuel, would there be credits given for that? Would that generate credits or not? Not from there, you said maybe not, huh?
With respect to our methodologies that we have now, we don't have something that would encapsulate that. But there are methodologies that look at on-farm emissions, and like if there's a reduction relative to the baseline, so going from diesel to a biofuel, for example, that may be a fit for someone's particular business model. The other thing that you can do is if there isn't something out there that really fits your business model, there are programs out there, whether it be us or whether it be other groups out there. They're actually willing to work with you and actually create a methodology that fits your business model a little bit more closely if there's a business case to be made for that. So if you were doing something like that at scale and there wasn't a methodology out there to follow along with, and both with yourself and an auditor to generate carbon credits, entities will actually work with you to develop one. So that's what's kind of unique about this space is it's ever evolving, and there's always new ways being conceptualized to actually heal our atmosphere in that way.
And if I can add, there are methodologies approved for solar PV on CDM. It's just they're extremely large scale, and it really feels over the top that you have to prove a significant additionality for them to grant you credits for it. So if it's a small scale solar project, it's really hard to prove that you're actually replacing a demand source that's just not going to be consumed elsewhere. So that additionality piece is much more vague at that level. And you have to have a large scale in order to really prove that you are replacing something that's going to be more emission intensive, such as natural gas, power, or even coal.
Yeah, I think that's why you said a utility size, looking at large scale. I have a really important question. I can't believe it hasn't been asked yet. How many tons of carbon per acre are we looking at? What are the numbers for a hemp farmer?
So there's a couple of different numbers out there right now, and definitely want to provide some context. So if we're looking at a hemp crop or something like that, a number for carbon credits annually that would be with respect to the soil portion of a project, let's say. Typically, we're seeing numbers anywhere between half a credit per acre to 2 credits per acre, or half a ton of CO2 per acre to 2 tons of CO2 per acre going into the soil. Hemp would more than likely be on the higher side of that scale, but it really depends on the practices adopted by the owner, as well as other factors like how efficiently they're farming, what kind of yield they're getting, how densely they're planting their hemp. Yeah. And then in terms of in the hemp itself, typically what we're seeing is around 1.6 tons of CO2 per ton of hemp. So on a per acre basis, it really depends on what kind of acreage yield you're getting on your hemp. Because it's more so on the volume of hemp rather than a per acreage basis, because that variable kind of moves the needle one way or the other.
So what have you seen, Seth? Have you done any deals yet, or is anybody buying or selling carbon credits using hemp yet?
Right now, we're in the process of building inventory. So we are right now enrolling farms. We have a couple different major partners right now that we're partnered with. And right now we're establishing those baselines with the goal of initial issuance as early as this year. And ideally, in the next 3 years, we could significantly build inventory. And, but yeah, and to kind of tail off Alex's answer there, it really does depend on the practices that you are using with hemp. I mean, if you're farming hemp and then you're just as intensive as corn and soybeans, it's going to be significantly lower than what you're hoping. It's still going to be more than likely better than corn and soy, but it's still going to detriment that. There's always going to be a give or take relationship when you're optimizing and trying to maximize yield versus what you're actually putting back into the soil. I mean, it's not perfect. Like, you have to be extremely mindful of the entire system, like of your entire operation. You can't just go, you can't go all out for yield and expect to put a lot of carbon back into the soil. That carbon is going to be put back into the plant material because the plant has the nutrition and has the resources to actually put that production into the biomass instead of the soil.
Okay. Clyde's got another question I'd like to ask. Does the landowner or developer get the credits on a multi-megawatt solar project? And then it's another question I was going to ask. So who gets the credit on this? Is it in a situation where a farmer's renting ground? Does the farmer get the credits for that, or does it belong to the landowner?
So typically the way that a carbon project is structured is that you'll have one of two cases, one where the landowner is the farmer and one where the farmer is not the landowner. So the case where the farmer is not the landowner, the farmer would have to obtain a legal proxy or a signature, allowing them to participate in a carbon project from the landowner on record. So the representative would then be eligible to receive payment for the carbon credits, but ultimately everything is up to the discretion of the landowner. So the other thing I'd like to point out as well is that there are agreements that can exist outside of the agreements that you have with your carbon program. So for example, if a carbon project was initiated by a farmer and they did not own the land, it was owned by someone else, and say they, outside of their relationship with us, they cut a deal with the landowner, and they could distribute the funds resulting from carbon credit sales appropriately between the two of them. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. But in general, to initiate projects, the biggest thing is that there's that stakeholder consultation, and that the appropriate landholders are privy to all the information and everything that's going on their land that they own. So if that kind of hopefully answers your question.
Rusty Peterson has a question. The hemp that has captured that carbon, is there traceability to its end use application to ensure its capture? But it sounds like the hemp, that's a soil, you keep referencing soil. So it wouldn't be based on what the hemp is used for, right? Turn it into frisbees or whatever. And it doesn't
the hemp has to go into a permanent storage of carbon. That is the biggest piece as far as plant material being considered sequestered. So if you put it into like a hempcrete and build a building out of it, that's proven to be a permanent store of carbon.
Or if you mill it and put it in plastics, like a plastic filler.
Yeah, plastics are that's a kind of a touchy subject, because technically bioplastics that are biodegradable cannot be sequestered because they are eventually broken down and re-emitted, either unless you prove that they were put into a hole in the ground and never came back into the atmosphere. That would be the only way you could skate around that. But then you would have to have traceability all the way to either the landfill or the composting facility for you to actually have the traceability there. But permanent stores of carbon can be traced through either a blockchain or elaborate accounting methods from point A all the way to the final user of that product.
Okay.
So if I can add something there, kind of to piggyback off Seth a little bit, one of the biggest tenets or one of the biggest requirements from buyers that they're demanding right now, and really sort of the broader regulatory infrastructure is demanding, is that there's an element of permanence to carbon removal. So for example, if the removal of CO2, let's just say, is a very transient thing. So for example, it was only removed for the very short term. So a really classic example of that would be hemp that was refined into CBD oil. You ingest the CBD, and then it's emitted as your body breaks it down and you exhale CO2, right? Mm-hmm. And it goes back into the carbon cycle. Whereas something that sequesters CO2 in a stable end use product, like hempcrete that Seth alluded to, and it's storing the CO2 within the plant for a long term. Typically, the proxy for long term is like 100 years, or sometimes they find a statistical proxy that suggests it'll be 100 years before they actually go to that length of tracking it for that long. That's really what people are looking for. And then the second part of that is with respect to the management plan. So there are things that go wrong. There are things that cause projects to go awry. There are things that happen where a stable end use product doesn't become stable anymore, or something gets broken and CO2 gets released, and not just because of force majeure, but because of a mishandling or mispractice or something like that. So there's a couple of things there. One is the track and trace method, where you can track the everything from the provenance of a hemp product all the way to its end use over a long term. The other is I guess more of a a loose management plan where you can kind of monitor the process and then account for any emissions that come from that in more of a conceptual way. So for example, that if somebody does do that, they'd be breaking a rule. So if you have a designated pathway and a penalty for deviating from that pathway, let's say a very severe one, we wouldn't anticipate someone to deviate from that plan, but having an accountability plan if they do. So one example would be if it was discovered that there was a statistically significant amount of CO2 that was re-emitted as a result of a negligent practice, you could actually purchase or reserve a certain amount of carbon credits as a buffer to that, or a form of insurance against something going wrong. So that's one of the ways that that's accounted for. And then if we look at things like oversight agencies, whether it be the SEC or something like that, if you're looking at something as a financial instrument, that's a big thing, is to make sure that there's a method of ensuring that there's compensation if something goes wrong. So that's definitely an important quality in more ways than one.
So I'm just going to talk about the auditor for a second. So you guys have the program, you guys do that, but you would not necessarily be the auditor, or the auditor wouldn't be hired through you guys. That would be a third-party, independent, non-related situation, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So they have to be a third party, completely independent. The reason for that, obviously, is if there's a conflict of interest in terms of the relationship between the carbon marketplace or registry and the carbon credit generator and the carbon credit auditor. What happens is the auditor may be a bit more optimistic in terms of quantifying how many carbon credits were earned. And really, the pushback on the demand side for those is they want to make sure that every carbon credit that's issued represents something that's real and a meaningful change relative to that baseline. And so we want to make sure that we're not issuing credits that represent nothing. Because of the fact that carbon credits, you can't hold them in your hands. It's not like a vegetable or like a crop. All it is a data trail at the end of the day. So really, that's the most integral part of this process, and something that carbon programs hold sacred. So that's really a key thing. Something else to keep in mind as well is that auditors, they definitely want to be qualified to actually make the judgments and assessments that they're making. So there's a number of different standards that or seals of approval that auditing firms will have. Some of them are ISO standards, some of them are ICROA standards, and these are really just universal sets of standards that buyers look for, particularly some of the most stringent ones, to make sure that it's upholding the most strict scientific principles available, that the auditing process is thorough, and that also just I guess that they're going to be accepted, and there's not going to be a chance that something falls through with respect to the issuance of the credit. So not only the credit issuance process, but also the handling of the process as it goes through a marketplace.
So who finds the auditor, and who pays for that auditor? Does the let's call it the farmer in this particular case, would it be the farmer that would then go out and find an auditor, and how would they do that, and who pays for their services?
So typically how it's structured is the auditing fee is a pass-through cost. So you would first connect with a carbon program, and through that carbon program, they would typically issue a competitive bid process. So they'd have a basic description of your project. So let's say you had a hemp farm and you were looking to sequester carbon, whether it's in the soil or through the plants or something like that. They would then find an array of auditors that are potentially available that would be qualified to oversee the project. And it would go to a competitive bid process. And then the farmer or the client would be able to select one, ideally, or typically based on the most competitive cost. But sometimes there are other factors as well, like the level of accolades from the auditor, or the timeline and availability of the auditor as well.
So the person who wants to buy those credits has to do the same thing on their side, right? I mean, they have to be audited to see what they're actually putting out and what they're actually getting, what they're asking for.
So
both sides.
It's just on the sell side that the auditing process takes place. On the buy side, it's more so a checklist of standards that buyers are looking for. Some are definitely far more stringent than others, but us as a firm, anyway, I can't speak for others, but us as a firm, we typically want to ensure that we're universally accepted and accepted by the most stringent of buyers, and making sure that we have the tightest seals of approval possible. So companies that are really quite stringent and really sort of have a laser focus on the credibility of these instruments would be a firm like Microsoft, for example. So they actually issue a mandate as to what they look for in terms of the quality of the credits that they buy.
So what is the market now for these carbon credits, ballpark figure kind of thing? And where do you see this going? Sounds like it's going to really explode, but it seems like it's kind of in its infancy right now. Is that right?
Definitely in its infancy right now. Definitely a lot of potential to explode. I think if you look at just the general sentiment across, the global investment community, I don't think anyone would argue that people are becoming less concerned with our impact on the climate over time. And so as a result, there's increasing demand and increasing awareness of these types of instruments. Right now, in terms of market pricing, again, I kind of alluded to earlier with respect to agricultural specific or cropland specific carbon credits, we're seeing anywhere from 15 to upper 20s on a per credit basis for pricing. And honestly, we've seen a number of projections out there where it wouldn't be outlandish to say within the next 5 to 10 years, we could see those prices quadruple. In my opinion, personally, I don't think that's outrageous at all, given the barriers to introducing supply into the market, and then the sheer amount of demand increase that we're seeing in the market as a result of the sentiment.
Yeah, like the EU marketplace is already above $80 or 80 euros per metric ton of carbon.
Wow.
There was also an article out this week that internationally, combining all the mandatory systems and cap and trade, such as the EU, Australia, all the others, that market estimate's already over 800 billion in 2021.
Wow.
So it's growing huge, and agriculture and soil is a little bit behind the curve of what they've been doing on energy, but there's a massive amount of potential there, as Alex.
80 euros would be somewhere in the ballpark of 90 or so dollars. Yeah, maybe a little more than that. So,
So this is obviously something not just the U.S. I mean, this is a worldwide situation that's going on.
Now, the U.S. might be a little behind, actually.
Yeah.
Well, and Blaine, sorry to cut you off, but something that's really great about what you just said is sort of the statement that it's a global market, and something that's interesting about carbon credits is, if you guys remember, I alluded to the fact that the different greenhouse gases are related to each other back to that universal currency of CO2, based on their global warming potential or their heat trapping effect. But the key word there is global. So a greenhouse gas, once it's emitted into the atmosphere, it disperses globally, right? Like the gas dissipates and it spreads out infinitely over time. And so if you remove CO2 or greenhouse gases in the United States, it has a global impact, right? So what's really interesting is you can aggregate projects together that aren't necessarily touching each other. So you could have two farms, one in the United States and one in Europe. And if they have similar, let's say, agricultural practices and they're owned by the same person, you could combine those together and capture the economy of scale for creating a carbon project. So it's kind of interesting that way, in the sense that it's such a global thing. And conversely, the credits you buy in the United States would have an impact globally, whether you're situated in the United States or whether you're situated elsewhere.
I can see that we're probably going to go over our hour, because this is a pretty good discussion we're having here. So I want to make sure that people understand how to get a hold of you, and I want to make sure we have enough time for Seth to be able to talk about your platforms and what you do. So let's talk about first, if anybody's interested in following up with you on your particular offers that you have, and how do they get a hold of you? What's the best way to get a hold of you guys?
Best way would be email. So you can reach us at carbon@panexchange.com. So PanXchange is spelled PAN, letter X, and then change.
And Seth, let's talk a little bit about your platform and what you have and how you offer that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we've facilitated the platform for quite a while. We had it in CBD and we launched into industrial products last year. And kind of what we've seen is there's still a lot of need for, so like the platform as it is now is very much built for like the bulk scale, bulk buyer. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of people very curious in this. And there's a lot of curiosity around hemp, and they're wanting to find necessarily smaller parcels of hemp. And we really don't cater to them how we are right now, particularly because some of the barriers of entry, as far as you need to be a bulk buyer, everything else. So to really facilitate and kind of help where that market is right now, we are creating a free version of the platform that is more catered towards individual products and is a lot more flexible as far as what buyers can access this. So it's really all about getting more buyers to the platform, getting more buyers into hemp, and really conglomerating across the different processors. Because there are a lot of things that we're seeing from the processor side is we don't have any room for additional sales on some side, especially on herd products, or we need additional feedstock. And then I talked to someone else at a different area and they're still trying to get rid of bales. So it's really kind of matching all of the haves and have nots. And what we're seeing is if we made that a free version of the platform, it would be a lot more accessible for the people just out there curious for hemp, but not necessarily able to access it through their local markets. So it's really just creating a transparent market that's very easy to access, and people can come on and look and actually see what's out there throughout the United States on hemp, and not just having to call somebody that's local to them and then finding out that they don't have supply. So it's really just creating more mixing and matching and then making it more accessible. And we're open to
my screen, right?
Yeah.
Do what?
I just want to share my screen. I just want to I wanted to bring up your website so people, if they went,
you didn't want to show the
right there. That's what I
platform
want.
out there under development.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to make a free version of the platform, and that should be out in the coming weeks. But yes, it's all about making hemp more accessible for the United States and just your common buyer. The people that are curious in hemp and not really wanting to buy a bulk load of hemp yet. It's catering to that market. And honestly, the conversations that we've had with people in the hemp industry, that we really feel like that's really what we need right now.
Is there a minimum size of hemp farmer? Because I imagine there's a cost to get this set up, right?
Are you talking about a carbon project or?
Right.
Yeah, so a couple of ways to think about this just in terms of the economic exercise. Number one is you want to think about how much carbon credit revenue you anticipate getting on an annual basis. You also want to think about what your pass-through costs are to your auditors and how many times you're going to have to pay them to audit your project throughout its life cycle. And then thirdly, there's also the fees for actually getting the project started. So kind of in weighing those. But in general, what we've seen, just for if you were only doing, let's say, a soil project, if you were only doing soil, and that's not something that has to be done with hemp, that would be more of a traditional crop, like let's say a corn or soy. If we were working with a corn or a soy client, I would say probably 1,000 acres would be minimum. But we can go in the sub 1,000 acre range for hemp clients because of the fact that they have the versatility to not only sequester CO2 or greenhouse gases in the soil, but it's also in particular long-lived end uses of the plant that are holding that carbon in there for the long term.
Yeah. I mean, if it's a fiber crop that's producing 5+ tons per acre, there's a lot of potential there. Especially, I mean, even at the smaller scale, there is a lot of potential there. But you have to prove where that biomass is going.
Yeah. So you're not going to grow for carbon credits. It wouldn't make sense to do it just for carbon credits. You have to have, this is a value added proposition.
Yeah, and it should be. I mean, if we overall started farming for carbon, and imagine if like 10 million acres was taken out of traditional agriculture in 1 year, what that would do to food prices in the food chain. So it's always going to be a big
butterfly effect. Yeah.
Yeah, and soil isn't going to sequester all the carbon we need by itself, but it is a valuable tool in the matrix of everything that we have offered. Of all the options that we have to sequester carbon, it is a tool that we can't afford to not use.
Well, that is a great way to end this segment and land this airplane too, because I think you're right, and it's exciting that it's gonna 4 times or 5 times its value over time. So you get to let's say with the fiber crop, if you're getting to $100 a ton, and you do 5 tons, $500 an acre. Now that's looking really interesting. I mean, that's going to be a significant impact. So it's exciting to see this develop. I'm glad to see you guys putting your energy into this. It's important.
For sure. And we just want to add to it's a great thing to be able to, I guess, finally reward people like farmers who are doing some of these really great regenerative practices and really, being such a great, obviously, and fundamental food source for everyone. So it's nice to be able to provide that access for people where not only are we noticing that they're doing these great practices and really helping, heal the planet, but now we're providing a pathway to help, financially incentivize and reward them for doing so.
Excellent.
Dave, I see we had a lot of questions come in. Did we cover all the questions everybody had?
We did. Clyde wants to know about his hayfield, but let's let Clyde reach out. So how's Clyde email you again? Because he's got more questions. So
yeah, so he can reach us at carbon@panexchange.com.
Beautiful. And the pan is PanXchange.com. Very good. Well, Alex and Seth, you got to stick around for the best part because we have a really good recipe coming up. But before we do that, Mike Brennan, what's going on with the 420 Post and the other side of the world?
I'm glad you asked, David. So we just had somebody on the show yesterday, 420 Post, and they came out with a survey, which wouldn't be particularly surprising. It's the Whitney Economics. And they surveyed a bunch of cannabis businesses around the country. And their number one, like 72%, their biggest issue was, this won't come as any surprise, banking. They can't find a bank to work with them. And so, or if they do, it's, absurd fees and things like that. The other thing that I found a little startling, and again, not particularly surprising, is only 42% of them are actually making a profit. So that means almost 60% of the folks in the cannabis business right now are not making a profit. And part of that is anybody that looks at going into this business, there's a lot of upfront costs. And it takes a while to get caught up on those. And then and then out with the pandemic and the fact that loans are hard to come by, it's not a really pleasant time for the cannabis folks because they're stretched so thin and it's just the cash flow is not there to cover overhead, and that's a losing proposition, right? So we had him on the show. If you want to read that whole study, there's a whole bunch of other points in there as well that you can go to MI Marijuana Report and read that. The other thing that I found kind of as an interesting story is we all know Mike Tyson, the old ear-biting heavyweight. Well, now he's come to Michigan with his own cannabis products, and they're being sold through the Common Citizen Group. But he's got a line of products called Pound for Pound Cake, Knockout OG, and he has something called undisputed cannabis flower. Now, I have not sampled any of these products, so I can't vouch for how good they are, but certainly they got the star brand there with Mike Tyson. Most everybody's heard that name, and geez, in business, that's 2/3 of business. You got a name recognition. You're going to at least get people to try it, whether they don't like it, they don't come back. But that's kind of a fun one I wanted to throw in there.
Excellent. All right. The slubs are well, and I noticed that Hempwood has one of the HGTV stars promoting Hempwood, which is Hempwood right behind me here. So I thought that was kind of cool. So it's good to see the celebrities getting involved in the space. That's very cool. So Blaine Bechtold, you have a little bit of news. You got a
I do. And moving this to the end of the show certainly has made us a little more time crunch with things, but I'll try to make it as quick as I can for everybody. One of the things, Mike, you talked about the banking. So the Safe Banking Act, of course, was tied on to the defense spending bill, and then it got taken out of that. So it has been and is going to be reintroduced on its own, and it may still get tied into defense, but they feel that the merits of this bill may be able to stand on its own. So real information there. US Hemp Roundtable has information. We'll have it on our site as well. But stay tuned for that, because it looks like the Safe Banking Act may get brought up again and into that. So
we need it.
Good news for everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's just a lot of stuff that needs to be changed, and that's certainly just one of them for sure. Also, we've talked about hemp and concrete, and there's some studies going on right now where hemp in concrete to make rebar might actually be stronger than steel.
I saw that.
So, yep. Again, we're going to keep tabs on that and talk more about that for sure. Cool. Also, what an interesting thing that came out, and I actually ordered some of this afternoon because it just came out. But Pepsi has come out with a new energy drink infused with hemp seed oil and B vitamins. And it's called Rockstar Unplugged, and it's focused more on enhancing good vibes rather than giving users a big energy boost. Well, I don't know about that, because it also has 80 milligrams of caffeine in it. 12 ounces. So
well, that'll make you vibrate, all right,
or something. Yeah,
I gotta believe it's got to get you going somehow on that. But if you go to rockstarenergy.com, you can actually order. I ordered it through there, and it comes through Amazon. I'm going to have it on Monday, or actually Sunday. It's going to be delivered, they say. And there's 3 different flavors that I have in right now. So looking forward to that. And we've always talked about the big players coming in through this. Now, this is not CBD that's put in this. This is the hemp seed oil, which I'll put a plug in here just right now.
So I heard Down on the Farm sells that. Am I correct on that?
I do manufacture this. This is true. Certainly not in the quantities that probably Pepsi needs it for their product, but it is. But it's hemp seed oil, not the CBD oil that they're putting into that. So the reason why it's okay for them is because hemp seed oil is considered generally safe. So that's why it's not an issue with them having to worry about where CBD lands on the side of FDA and everything. So that's not a problem there. The other thing we want to give a little shout out to, and I can share, right, Dave? I can share my screen?
Yeah.
All right. Is CBD store up in, here we go, in Fremont. Has a bunch of specials going on right now they want everybody to know about for the Valentine's Day. And it's very hard for them to keep their bath bombs in. They got 25% off their gummies right now, and their Valentine's bath bombs they're only $8. They're on sale for $5. So if you're looking for something something for the sweetie, maybe a good place to go would be there and order that for that. Also, they are doing a raffle for a hempwood putter. Blue Lake CBD is on it, and so they're $10 a ticket for that. So again, if you go to Blue Lake CBD, and you can get through the CBD store, but that's where you can pick up those raffle tickets for that. Very cool, very, very stylish.
And if I recall, the putter is worth like $500 or something. Right?
Yeah, if you want your own customized putter, go to ihempmfg.com. iHemp Manufacturing.
And they also are sponsoring a 5/17 golf outing. It's the 4th annual. It's a Gorilla Glue Open. It's a 4-man scramble. It's going to be May 14th at Devils Lake Golf Course in Manitou Beach, Michigan, where it's going to be. And you can find information again on their Blue Lake site for that. So they're already half filled. They're only going to have 400, I think that's right, 400 golfers, I think is what they're going to have.
Wow, that's a big
That's a
one.
lot. It's an all-day event, I'm sure, that's for sure. But certainly don't want to miss out on that for sure on that. So
You might want to talk about this, Blaine, real quick.
yes, absolutely. We want to talk about that because I know that Seth, and I hope that Alex will come join us. This is the Power of Hemp. It's the Midwest iHemp Expo, going to be held in Lansing on January 20th and 21st. Great lineup, and there'll be some information very soon up there on the speakers and all the costs and everything else involved with it. And then Friday night, of course, we're going to have the Hempy Awards. So if you're making anything out of hemp, including that putter, Dave, would be a great thing to enter into the contest for that. Great way to get exposure for all your CBD or hemp products that you're doing for sure. So
Well, and wait. Now you've also invited the cannabis community to come. And I know Jamie Cooper yesterday from Sensi Magazine was promoting it on her segment.
yeah.
Beautiful.
So
Yeah.
in March the 1st, they're having a huge, nice little party in Lansing at the Crossway Bay Hotel. It's a Mardi Gras party. And I'm sorry, I think we didn't get her on the show. We were going to talk about that. Maybe we'll get her on the next show. And so you can get tickets for that. I think it's $50 for the VIP pass, $25 for the regular. They're going to have a lot of exhibitors there.
Swag, giveaways. It's a consumption event. Covers lots of bases.
Yeah, expecting a good turnout. It's at the
Crossway Bay Hotel.
Causeway Bay.
Causeway Bay, yep.
Hotel in Lansing, yep. South side of Lansing is where it's at. So that's March 1st. You can get your tickets now. And if you want to be a vendor or an exhibitor there, there's also information on that too. So
Go to sensyconnects.com, I do believe. Sensi Connects.
Go ahead, Dave, say that again.
sensyconnects.com.
There you go. That's how you can find out that. Anything else I'm forgetting, guys?
I think
No,
that's
it.
it.
Now we're ready
I'll share
for
the recipe. I've got
the big
recipe
the
up
big
here.
shoe element. Are you ready there,
Seth and
Blaine?
Alex, I want to thank you again for being on the show. And you guys are going to be there in May. So if you got a lot of other questions, you know how to get a hold of them. PanXchange, and then they'll be at the expo as well. We'll be able to talk to them face to face if you're interested in that. So without further ado, we will get to our recipe for this week's show. So, it's wintertime, right? And everybody's thinking about how, it's only 6 weeks now, we said, till, so winter's over. So it's not that long, but
Yeah.
blueberry hemp smoothie, because I always buy blueberries in the summer because I'm in the blueberry country over here, and we freeze them. And then we can use them throughout the year. And this is one of the great ways to use it. It's a blueberry hemp smoothie. Again, you know that I like making things quick and simple. And this is a 5-minute. So
Who's Teresa?
what's that?
Who's Teresa?
Who's Teresa?
Teresa's the recipe. Yeah.
That I don't know who Teresa's with.
That's her recipe. Okay.
Eatingmadeeasy.com. That's what I have on this one.
Okay.
Yep, and this is Teresa came up with this one. So it's a cup of vanilla soy milk. It's a half a cup of plain no-fat yogurt. It's a tablespoon of almond butter, 1/4 cup of hemp seeds, a half a cup of blueberries frozen, a banana fresh or frozen, and a cup of ice cubes. And
You
I'll
can make
mix
this
up-
with hemp milk. If this soy instead of soy milk, it could be vanilla hemp milk.
It could be, yep. And we have a recipe for that on the site.
We do.
Sure. That's on there, and we're getting better, right? We're showing how we make them now.
Oh, that's
So
beautiful.
we got it there, and also I have my I have my hemp straw in here as well.
Oh, very cool.
So by Green Tech on that one. So yeah,
Green Tech Planet.
yeah. So
So take a big drink and see if you get a brain freeze. Yep, no.
no brain freeze, but this is a wonderful, wonderful, great drink. Very very robust flavor, and I think you'll enjoy it at any time of the year. But a good way to keep thinking about summer and spring is coming, folks. It really is. I know that Flint got their 12th largest snowstorm, and so great for you guys. I get that every day over here almost sometimes. but yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you for being on the show. Again, you know how to get a hold of them if you got more questions. There's a lot to talk about on this carbon stuff, and I think a good opportunity for farmers to be able to, again, you're not going to farm for carbon credits, but if you're farming, you can get farm credits. So that's what we're looking for. So thanks for joining us this week. Next week, we got Annie Roush, and we're going to talk about all the hype that came out a few weeks ago on the CBDA and CBGA, and how, of course, that's it may be helping with the COVID situation. remember on this situation there that was only done in the lab to start with. A lot more research has got to be done on that, but Annie's going to help expel all of those myths and certainly inform us on what is true and what's going on in that world. So, everybody, thanks for joining us this week. I know we went a little over, but good show. So,
all right, see you next week.
All right, thanks everybody.
All right, take care, guys. See you.